There's a few concessions and caveats that we're going to make along the way here, but I think the general message here is don't seek the secret will of God. It's dangerous, it's detestable, it is lethal. Don't pursue the secret will of God, and furthermore, don't pretend that you have the secret will of God from anything other than authorized sources that God has supplied for you.
Welcome back to another episode of Theologically Driven. We start up today a two-part series on the will of God and how to make biblical decisions. We'll be joined by Dr. Mark Snoeberger, who's the professor of systematic theology here at DBTS. Before we begin today's episode, I just wanted to let you know that this podcast is available wherever you listen to podcasts. So if you're watching here on YouTube or on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts, this podcast is available. So we would encourage you to share the show with anyone who you might think would benefit from these episodes. And so I'd encourage you to get subscribed so you don't miss an episode, or leave us a review if you found the information helpful. Thanks for your support of the show. Now let's welcome Dr. Mark Snowberger to the podcast. Dr. Snowberger, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Good to be here.
Yeah, so we want to talk a little bit about God's will. Recently, you gave a talk or a session to some college-age interns here at our church, and you went to this topic of God's will. Why'd you pick that?
Well, it was one of several that was selected for me. So, okay. but I do think it's an important topic just because there's a lot of misinformation out there about decision making and the will of God.
So, we'll say there are two wills of God, right? So, yeah. Maybe you could start by explaining what are those and how do you define them?
Yeah, and sometimes this may seem like begging the question here, but I think if we look at the scriptures, there are at least two. We'll discuss whether there's a third, but at least two meanings for the will of God that we find in the Bible, and most have to accept this. I mean, we've got passages like Ephesians 1, which talks about God doing all things according to the counsel of his own will. You've got Isaiah 46 that says, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. I say my purpose will stand and I will do all my pleasure. Whatever I have planned, I will do. So there's this sovereign will of God, sometimes called the decretal will of God. This includes everything that God has rendered certain in his universe. And that includes good things and bad things, which is actually going to come back to this discussion later, because there are certain things in God's decretal will that we really shouldn't be pursuing. Mm-hmm. They will happen, but they shouldn't. Yeah, I'm drawn to this. There's this passage here in Matthew. If anyone who causes one of these little ones to believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. Okay, but here's the commentary. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to sin. These things must come, but woe to the man through whom they come. So there it is. God's decretal will is that bad things are going to happen in the universe. That doesn't mean you ought to want to do them,
right?
Necessarily.
And it doesn't mean that you're not responsible for them.
Correct. So the sovereign will of God is something that we're not necessarily going to try to fulfill point for point, okay? What do we do with the sovereign will of God? Well, we simply acquiesce to it. It's sometimes called the secret will of God because God does not reveal it in his word, all the details of what's going to happen. And when they happen, we roll with it because we don't know it's coming. We simply acquiesce to what God has planned. So there's the sovereign will of God. There's also the moral will of God, sometimes called the directive will of God. If you want to have decretal directive, that works. This is what God says you ought to do. Okay, and I'm drawn to our passage in Thessalonians here, 1 Thessalonians 4:3. It's God's will that you should be sanctified and avoid sexual immorality. Well, this obviously is not the decretal will of God, because there are plenty of people over the years who have violated this. They have not been sexually pure. And for this reason, we can say they did not follow God's will. Well, it's his decretal will, but it is not his directive will. He does not want us to do this. He does not desire us to do this. Perhaps you could use that word here. And so this is the will of God that is revealed in all of its specificity in the Scriptures. Okay, these are the things that God says you must do and must not do. And so if we're talking about finding the will of God in this sense, then yes, do it, right? Mm-hmm. Search the Scriptures every day to discover what God has specifically told you to do and to not do. But don't expand it beyond what he has told us in the Scriptures.
Right. So in that sense, it's limited to moral decrees, right? Oughts and ought not.
Correct.
Not, trivial matters of life, basically.
Or even important matters like who you're going to marry or what career to choose.
Right. Yeah. So in your discussion with the guys, you went to Deuteronomy 18, and that's where you started on a discussion of divination. Why'd you go there?
Yeah, I'm taking my cue from Bruce Waltke. Bruce Waltke has a little book on decision making in which well, let me just find the title. He says here, Finding the Will of God, subtitle, A Pagan Notion, which is sort of a startling statement here because who doesn't want to find the will of God? Well, based on our definitions, we shouldn't want to find God's will or discover God's will if we're talking about his decretal will, his sovereign will. In fact, that's why I started here with Deuteronomy 18, which is probably, if I can put it this way, it's the longest passage we have in the Bible on discovering the secret will of God. Okay, so let me read it. It's a little longer, so I think it's going to pop up on the screen here. But let me go ahead and read some of this from Deuteronomy 18. When you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist or one who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord, and because of these detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. But you must be blameless before the Lord your God. The nations you dispossess listen to those who practice sorcery or divination. But as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. Instead, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him. For this is what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly when you said, Let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see the great fire any more, or we will die. The Lord said to me that time, What they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among your brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I commanded him. If anyone does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name, anything I have not commanded him to say, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, must be summarily put to death. Okay, so this passage really, if we have in a nutshell, a manual on how we should and shouldn't pursue God's will. There's a few concessions and caveats that we're going to make along the way here, but I think the general message here is don't seek the secret will of God. It's dangerous, it's detestable, it is lethal. Don't pursue the secret will of God, and furthermore, don't pretend that you have the secret will of God from anything other than authorized sources that God has supplied for you. If you do, death penalty. I mean, it's a really serious, really serious event here. The death penalty is reserved for particularly serious sins. And here we have the death penalty assigned to someone who seeks God's will from unauthorized sources and or who stands up and says, I have a word from the Lord. I say do that deliberately here, right? I have a word from the Lord that isn't the word from the Lord. Somebody who does that, put him to death.
Yeah. So why in these cases, why are those capital crimes? What would fit that category?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the capital crimes in Scripture, they sort of fall into categories, and all of them are threats to the civil order, if I can put it that way. Of course, crimes against persons that result in their death are sort of the most well-known of the capital crimes. But then also crimes against the family. So a number of sexual crimes, both inside and outside of marriage, are capital crimes. I think this is where the recalcitrant child, the violent child who rises up against his parents fits in. We also have crimes against the state and against the ruler of that state, who's God. So we've got crimes for blasphemy in the Old Testament, and so these are crimes that destabilize the state and the state religion. Okay, and so we want to fit this crime into that grid here, and I think we can't. So what is the crime here? Well, we've said it here is seeking guidance from unauthorized sources, non-normative sources, and then assigning the results to God, okay? And then, perhaps more than that, just leveraging that information in such a way that is to your advantage here. And the point is that God speaks inerrantly and normatively to us, but only through his authorized sources that are very strictly defined in the rest of this passage. And so to say that you know God's will when you don't is a very dangerous thing. And I think the point is it creates then uncertainty. It creates at best an unnecessary source of divine revelation and potentially a competing one, right? So a competing source of divine revelation. And so this crime sows seeds of doubt about the authority and even the necessity of the Word of God. It takes the words of the prophet who is assigned by God and diffuses them so that the people do not listen to it and listen to something else.
Yeah. So are you saying then that, so if we kind of bring it over to today when we start thinking about discussions of God's will, someone standing up and saying, I know God's will for my life is akin to the sorcery found here in the Old Testament?
Well, again, it depends on what you mean by the will of God. If we're talking about the moral will of God that is revealed in the Christian scriptures, right, I can say, I know it is God's will to remain faithful to my wife.
Right.
I mean, I can say
because
that
that's written down for you.
It's written down
Bible.
for me.
Yeah.
But for a young man to say, I know it is God's will for me to marry X or to pursue this career, or I know that God has called me to the ministry, when there is no chapter and verse to which you can point, I think that's a very dangerous thing to do and something we should avoid. So if I can start, I mean, we're not really starting at this point, but I think the question we should ask is not how do I discover the will of God, but how do I make biblical decisions?
Right.
That's really the question that's under review here.
Yeah, and the problem with the guy, so take the guy standing up and saying, I know I'm called to ministry, or it's God's will for me to be called to ministry, is he is in fact putting words in God's mouth.
Right.
That may actually be a true thing, and there may be some, there may be a church that would want to call him to be their pastor someday. But to stand up and say, God told me this, that you can't do that.
Yeah, you can't. It's dangerous. It's wrong. And if I'm understanding Deuteronomy 18 right, it's a capital crime under the law. So it's not as though that somehow is sanitized in the New Testament.
So are there some discontinuities between the Old Testament and New Testament here that might soften this a little bit? Because, so like at their point, they don't have written scriptures yet. Yeah. How are you thinking about that?
I mean, at this point, they don't have any written scriptures. Yeah. So we are reduced to a discussion here about what prophets say, and that passage details the introduction of the prophetic office, right? So they're at Horeb, they're at Mount Sinai. God is speaking dramatically from the top of the mountain. The people are terrified. They come to Moses and say to him, is there some way we can get this data from God without going through this? And so Moses relays the question to God. God says, "This, they've got a point. Yeah, there's something to this request. Yes, I can do that. I will appoint here authorized spokesmen for me. They're called prophets. So long as the people listen to them as though they were listening to me and do everything that he says." Okay, those are the conditions that he gives for supplying these prophets. And so, yes, I will speak through these prophets, but only through these prophets. And I think that's the whole point of the chapter. This is the only vehicle that I use to reveal my will. Now, immediately we have the caveat, well, what about, say, the Urim and the Thummim? And what about those court prophets which could be consulted? So you could ask, what is God's will? And so we do have to at least make concession, make room for those. So the Urim and the Thummim, rather a mysterious device that was used by the king, held by the high priest, but used by the king to inquire of the Lord. Okay, and when you see that phrase, they inquired of the Lord, I think it means one of two things. They asked a question to this Urim, or they inquired of one of the court prophets. That's how they would inquire of the Lord. And so in the age of incomplete revelation, there apparently was some sort of caveat here, some sort of exception made that you could request the prophet to speak. Or you could request this device, this Urim, to give an answer from God. So we don't have an absolute tit-for-tat kind of connection here with the New Testament. That doesn't mean we discard it, because I think in general the message is still there.
Yeah, exactly. So then for us, for New Testament Christians, where should we put our focus on? So there can be a lot of focus on, I want to find God's will for my life.
Yeah.
But then you're suggesting differently.
Well, find God's will if it means finding what God morally requires. Okay.
Yep.
So anything that is directive, anything that is contained within the scriptures, anything that you can point to chapter and verse, and you can conclusively apply to yourself, then you can say, God told me. That's well within the purview of what you can say. But if you're talking about, I want to find this secret will of God, I want to, and I think what we have here is something of a semi-Gnostic kind of idea here. If I'm really holy, and if I ask God with enough sincerity, He's going to pull back the corner and give me a glimpse of His secret will. And so then I have the advantage of knowing what that is, and I can align myself with it. And that's I think, exactly what Moses is saying you can't do here. Yep. You know, it's interesting. Last week, I was sitting in church. I was listening, right? And our pastor read something from 2 John, and I was sort of looking about short books. You can read the whole thing while you're sitting there. And I read there in verse 9, do not run ahead of God. And I thought, wow, I somehow missed that being in the Bible. I know people talk about don't run before God, and I always sort of scratched my head when I heard that. But I realized, okay, here it is. Don't run ahead of God. And it goes on in the context to say what that means, okay? He's actually addressing sort of a proto-Gnostic problem of people who are speaking beyond what God has said and pretending that is from God. So the people who run ahead of God are those who say more than what the scriptures say about what God's expectations are. It's kind of funny because the people who have sort of hijacked that verse, don't run ahead of God, is, just sit there and wait until God sort of gives you your little vision of what you need to do. It's actually the opposite of what's intended.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So we need to be focused then on biblical decision making, and we'll talk more about that in the next episode. So thank you, Dr. Snoeberger, for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Theologically Driven. We look forward to next Thursday for part 2 of this series. Theologically Driven is a podcast of Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. If you'd like to learn more about our seminary, just go to dbts.edu.